Robert Mitchell stared at the half-empty glass of scotch in front of him, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the Boston pub where he'd been spending most of his Friday evenings lately. The worn wooden table beneath his elbows had witnessed countless conversations, celebrations, and breakdowns over the years, but tonight it merely supported the weight of his growing regrets. "You know, drinking alone isn't exactly the healthiest hobby," a familiar voice said, pulling Robert from his thoughts. His brother Daniel slid into the seat across from him, removing his navy peacoat and hanging it on the back of his chair. Robert managed a weak smile. "Who says I'm alone? I've got good old Johnny Walker keeping me company." Daniel signaled the bartender and ordered himself a beer. "Mom's been calling you. Says you haven't picked up in weeks." "Been busy," Robert mumbled, knowing how pathetic the excuse sounded even as he said it. "Too busy to return a phone call to your 70-year-old mother who just had knee surgery? That's a new level of busy, even for you." Daniel's tone was light, but his eyes revealed genuine concern. Robert sighed, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that had become his constant companion since the divorce papers were finalized 3 months ago. "How is she doing anyway?" "She's fine. Stubborn as ever. Refuses to use the walker the doctor gave her." Daniel paused as the bartender delivered his beer. "But she's worried about you." "We all are." Robert scoffed. "Oh, you mean you and Mom? Because I'm pretty sure Dad's too busy with his new family to spare a thought for his disappointment of a firstborn." Daniel took a long sip of his beer before responding. "He asked about you too, you know. Right? Let me guess. He wanted to know if I've finally pulled myself together yet." Robert's fingers tightened around his glass. "Actually, he wanted to know if you'd consider coming to Thanksgiving this year. At his place." Robert nearly choked on his drink. "You've got to be kidding me. Thanksgiving at Dad and Diane's house, with their perfect children and their perfect life in their perfect suburban mansion? Hard pass. Those perfect children are your half-siblings, Rob. Emma is 16 now and Jacob's 14. They barely know their older brother." The guilt hit Robert like a physical blow. It wasn't the kids' fault that their father had walked out on his first family to start a new one. That their mother had been the secretary Dad couldn't resist when he was still married to Mom. That their existence represented everything that had gone wrong in Robert's childhood. "Yeah, well, whose fault is that?" Robert muttered. Daniel leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. "It's been 20 years, Rob. 20 years since Dad left. You were 12. I was 10. It was awful, I remember. But at some point, you have to stop letting it define your entire life." Robert's jaw clenched. "Easy for you to say. You've got the perfect marriage, perfect career, perfect little daughter. Life worked out pretty well for you, didn't it?" As soon as the words left his mouth, Robert regretted them. Daniel had worked incredibly hard for everything he had. His brother's success wasn't handed to him. He'd earned it through years of dedication and perseverance. Daniel's expression hardened. "You think my life is perfect? Melissa and I went to marriage counseling for 2 years to work through our issues. I missed half of Sophie's first year because I was working 70-hour weeks trying to make partner at the firm. Nothing was handed to me, Rob. I just didn't use Dad's choices as an excuse to sabotage my own life." The truth in Daniel's words stung, but Robert wasn't ready to acknowledge it. "I didn't sabotage anything. Sarah left me because you were never emotionally available," Daniel finished for him. "Because you were so afraid of becoming Dad that you never fully committed to your marriage. Sarah told Mom everything, you know." Robert felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Great. So everyone's been talking about my failed marriage behind my back. Fantastic. We're worried about you," Daniel repeated. "You've been spiraling since the divorce. You barely see your friends, you're drinking too much, and according to Jenkins at your office, you're this close to getting fired for missing deadlines." Robert's head snapped up. "You talked to Jenkins? What the hell, Dan? You had no right to." "He called me, actually," Daniel interrupted. "Because apparently your emergency contact information hasn't been updated since we were in college. He was concerned when you didn't show up for the Peterson meeting last week." The Peterson meeting, the most important client presentation of the quarter, and Robert had completely forgotten about it. He'd spent that day in his apartment, blinds drawn, ignoring his alarm and his phone, lost in a haze of self-pity. "Look," Daniel continued, his voice softening. "I didn't come here to lecture you. I came because I think you need help, Rob. Professional help, maybe. And also because Dad is really serious about Thanksgiving. He wants to try to make amends. Robert laughed bitterly. Make amends? After 20 years of barely acknowledging my existence except to criticize my choices? That's rich. He's getting older, Rob. He had that health scare last year. I think he's realizing that he doesn't have unlimited time to fix his mistakes. Daniel hesitated, then added, None of us do. The brothers sat in silence for a long moment, the ambient noise of the pub filling the space between them. Robert stared into his glass, thinking about his father's invitation, about his mother recovering from surgery without her eldest son's support, about the half-siblings he barely knew. I'll think about it, Robert finally said, not meeting Daniel's eyes. Daniel nodded, knowing it was the most he could hope for at the moment. That's all I'm asking. As they sat there in the dimly lit corner of the pub, Robert felt something shift inside him, a tiny crack in the wall of resentment he'd built over 2 decades. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face his father or the past that still haunted him, but for the first time in years, he was willing to consider the possibility. The drive to Lexington took longer than Robert remembered. Maybe it was the light November snow that had started to dust the roads, or maybe it was his own reluctance that seemed to make each mile stretch endlessly before him. His rental car's GPS chimed pleasantly, directing him to turn onto Maple Avenue, a street he hadn't visited in 2 decades. You can still turn around, he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter as anxiety churned in his stomach. But he didn't turn around. Instead, he followed the familiar curves of the neighborhood where his father now lived with his second family. The houses were larger than he expected, with manicured lawns and luxury cars in driveways. His father had clearly done well for himself after the divorce. Robert pulled up to a colonial-style house with a wide front porch and warm lights glowing from within. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway, and holiday decorations were already tastefully arranged along the walkway. It looked like something from a magazine, the perfect family home. Nothing like the cramped apartment where he and Daniel had grown up with their mother after the split. He sat in the car for several minutes, engine off, gathering courage. The snow was falling more steadily now, collecting on his windshield. Finally, a tap on his window startled him. A teenage girl with dark hair pulled into a ponytail stood beside his car, her breath fogging in the cold air. She grinned and motioned for him to roll down the window. You must be Robert, she said when he complied. I'm Emma. Are you planning to sit out here all night, or would you like to come inside where it's warm? Her direct approach, coupled with the hint of mischief in her eyes, reminded Robert so much of Daniel at that age that he found himself smiling despite his nerves. Just admiring the house, he lied, grabbing the bottle of wine he'd brought from the passenger seat. Dad's been pacing by the window for the last half hour, Emma said matter-of-factly. He's super nervous about you coming. It's kind of funny, actually. I've never seen him this worked up. The idea of his confident, always in control father being nervous about seeing him was so unexpected that Robert momentarily forgot his own anxiety. He got out of the car and followed Emma up the path to the front door. Mom made, 5 different pies because no one knew which kind you like, Emma continued as they walked. And Jacob's been practicing telling you about his coding club all week because he heard you work in tech. The casual way she shared these details, as if it were perfectly normal that her family had been preparing so thoughtfully for his visit, caught Robert off guard. He'd spent 20 years assuming his father never thought about him at all. Before he could process this information, the front door opened. His father stood in the entryway, looking both familiar and like a stranger. William Mitchell had more gray in his hair than Robert remembered, and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but he still stood with the same straight-back posture that had intimidated Robert throughout his childhood. You made it, William said simply, his voice betraying more emotion than his carefully composed expression. Robert nodded stiffly. Traffic was heavier than I expected. An awkward silence stretched between them until Diane appeared beside her husband, wiping her hands on an apron. She was attractive in a wholesome way, with laugh lines around her eyes and a warm smile that seemed genuine. Robert, we're so glad you could join us, she said, stepping forward to give him a brief, unexpected hug. Please, come in out of the cold. The interior of the house was warm and inviting, with the delicious smells of Thanksgiving dinner filling the air. Robert handed the wine to Diane, who thanked him graciously. A lanky teenage boy, Jacob, presumably, hovered in the doorway to what appeared to be the living room, watching Robert with unconcealed curiosity. "Nice to meet you," Robert offered, feeling increasingly out of place. "You too," Jacob replied, eyes widening slightly. "Dad says you help develop security systems for banking apps. That's really cool." Before Robert could respond, the front door opened again, and Daniel entered with his wife Melissa and their 7-year-old daughter Sophie. "Uncle Robert," Sophie exclaimed, running to give him a hug around the waist. At least with her, Robert felt comfortable. He'd made an effort to be present in his niece's life, even during his darkest post-divorce days. "Hey, Squirt," he said, ruffling her hair. "You've grown at least a foot since I last saw you." 3 inches, Sophie corrected seriously. Daddy measured on the wall. Daniel caught Robert's eye over his daughter's head and gave him an encouraging nod. The message was clear. "See, this isn't so bad." Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The conversation flowed more easily than Robert had anticipated, with Emma and Jacob eager to learn about their older half-brother's life. Daniel skillfully kept things light, sharing funny stories from their childhood that didn't involve the divorce or its aftermath. Diane proved to be an excellent cook and a gracious hostess, refilling glasses and encouraging second helpings without being pushy. Throughout the meal, Robert found himself stealing glances at his father, trying to reconcile this older, more subdued man with the distant, critical figure from his memories. William seemed different here, more engaged, more attentive to those around him. He laughed at Jacob's jokes and listened intently when Emma talked about her debate team victories. He was, Robert realized with a pang, the kind of father he'd always wished for as a child. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Robert found himself alone in the kitchen with William. His father was rinsing dishes before loading them into the dishwasher, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. "You don't have to help," William said when he noticed Robert picking up plates from the table. "You're a guest." "It's fine," Robert replied, continuing to clear the table. "Mom always made us help with dishes, even on holidays. Some habits stick." William nodded, a flicker of something, regret? Nostalgia? Crossing his face. "Your mother ran a tight ship. She had to, I suppose, raising you boys on her own." The implicit acknowledgement hung in the air between them. After a moment, William turned off the water and faced his son. "Robert, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. For leaving. For not being the father you and Daniel deserved." Robert set down the stack of plates he was holding, unsure how to respond. He'd imagined this moment countless times over the years, but now that it was happening, he found himself at a loss for words. "I was selfish," William continued when Robert remained silent. "I convinced myself that you boys would be better off, that your mother would be better off, without me making everyone miserable. But that was just an excuse to pursue what I wanted without facing the consequences." Robert leaned against the counter, arms crossed defensively across his chest. "Why now? Why after all these years?" William sighed heavily. "Last year, when I had that heart attack scare, it made me think about my life differently. About the mistakes I've made. About the people I've hurt." He paused, then added quietly, "About the son I've lost." For 20 years, Robert had held on to his anger like a shield, protecting himself from the pain of abandonment. But standing in his father's kitchen, seeing the genuine remorse in the older man's eyes, he felt that shield begin to crack. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Robert said honestly. "Not yet, anyway." William nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. Just a chance to try to make things right. Whatever that might look like." From the living room came the sound of laughter. Emma and Jacob teasing Daniel about something while Sophie giggled in delight. The easy, familial warmth of the scene contrasted sharply with the tense conversation in the kitchen. "I should get back to the others," William said after a moment, clearly giving Robert space to process. "Take your time. There's no rush." As his father turned to leave, Robert found himself saying, "Dad?" The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years of avoiding it. William stopped, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "I'll think about it," Robert said, echoing the same non-committal phrase he'd given Daniel at the pub. But this time, he meant it differently. This time, it felt like the beginning of something rather than an evasion. William nodded, understanding the weight of those simple words. "That's all I can ask for." The holidays passed with cautious steps toward reconciliation. Robert agreed to a monthly lunch with his father, awkward affairs at first that gradually eased into something resembling comfort. He attended Jacob's science fair in January. Surprised by the swell of pride he felt watching his half-brother explain his coding project to impress judges. By February, he was teaching Emma to drive in empty parking lots on weekends, laughing at her dramatic reactions to every near miss with a light pole. His mother, Patricia, observed these developments with a mix of caution and quiet support. "Just be careful," she warned during one of their weekly phone calls. "I don't want to see you hurt again." "I'm not 12 anymore, Mom," Robert reminded her gently. "I can handle disappointment if it comes to that." But privately, he wondered if he really could. The more time he spent with William and his second family, the more he found himself investing emotionally in these newfound relationships. There was something healing about seeing his father as a flawed human being rather than the villain of his childhood narrative. It was during one of their father-son lunches in late March that William mentioned the attic clean-out. "Diane's on a decluttering kick," he explained between bites of his sandwich. "Says we need to get rid of 20 years of accumulated junk before we even think about downsizing for retirement." Robert nodded absently, his mind on a work project that was due the following week. "Anyway," William continued, "I found some things I thought you might want. Photo albums, school reports, some trophies from your Little League days." Robert looked up, surprised. "You kept that stuff?" Something like embarrassment crossed William's face. "I kept everything, Robert. Every school picture, every birthday card you boys sent me, even after." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "Even after I didn't deserve them." The admission stirred something in Robert's chest, a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "I was thinking maybe you could come by this weekend," William suggested. "Take a look through the boxes, see if there's anything you want to keep." Robert agreed, more out of curiosity than any real desire for childhood mementos. That Saturday, he found himself in his father's attic, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled in his father's neat handwriting. Robert, elementary school; Daniel, middle school; boys, sports. The methodical organization was surprising. Robert had always remembered his father as somewhat careless with sentimental items, often forgetting birthdays and anniversaries during the marriage. Yet here was evidence of meticulous preservation spanning decades. "I'll leave you to it," William said, seeming to understand Robert's need for privacy. "Shout if you need anything. I'll be downstairs helping Jacob with his math homework." Alone in the dusty attic, Robert began opening boxes. He found report cards with his teacher's comments. "Robert shows exceptional problem-solving skills, but needs to apply himself more consistently." Ribbons from science fairs, and photographs of himself at various ages, gap-toothed and grinning in elementary school, sullen and withdrawn in the years following the divorce. In a box labeled Family, 2000 to 2004, he discovered photos he'd never seen before. Himself at a school concert, playing saxophone while William watched from the audience. Daniel receiving a soccer trophy, with William standing proudly nearby. Photos that proved his father had been present at events Robert had no memory of him attending. "That's weird," he murmured, flipping through more photos. Had his father really been at these events? Or had William doctored these photos somehow? But that made no sense. Why would he go to such lengths only to keep the photos boxed away in an attic? At the bottom of the box, Robert found a manila envelope marked "Private" in his father's handwriting. He hesitated, respecting the label, but curiosity won out. Inside was a stack of greeting cards, birthday cards, Father's Day cards, Christmas cards, all signed by Robert and Daniel. Beneath these was a thicker stack of envelopes, many unopened, addressed to Robert and Daniel Mitchell in his father's handwriting. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he opened one dated December 25, 2004, the Christmas after the divorce. "Dear boys," it began, "I miss you terribly this Christmas. The house feels empty without your laughter and excitement. I know you're probably having a wonderful time with your mother, and that's as it should be, but I want you to know I'm thinking of you constantly." The letter continued, expressing love, regret, and hopes for their futures. Robert opened another, then another. Each contained similar sentiments: his father's unwavering love despite their separation, details about his life that he'd wanted to share with his sons, questions about their activities and interests, letters that had never been sent. Robert sat back on his heels, mind reeling. There were dozens of these letters spanning years, none of which he or Daniel had ever received. A cold realization began forming in his gut. Find anything interesting? Robert startled at his father's voice. William stood at the top of the attic stairs, his expression unreadable. These letters, Robert said, his voice tight. You wrote to us for years. Why didn't you send them? William sighed heavily, moving to sit on an old trunk across from his son. I did send them, Robert. Every week at first, then every month as the years went on. Birthday cards, Christmas gifts, letters. He gestured to the stack of unopened envelopes. These are the ones that came back to me. The rest, I don't know what happened to them. The implication hung in the air between them. Robert shook his head, unwilling to believe what his father was suggesting. No, he said firmly. Mom wouldn't have kept these from us. She always encouraged us to have a relationship with you. She's the one who drove us to the visitations when your car broke down or when you were stuck at work. William's brow furrowed in confusion. Robert, I never missed a scheduled visitation unless your mother canceled. And my car issues? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't try to rewrite history, Robert snapped, anger flaring. You were barely there. You missed birthdays, school events, holidays. I was at everything Patricia would tell me about, William countered, his voice rising slightly. Half the time I'd show up at your school functions and be told by your teachers that your mother had requested I not attend. I had to find out about your saxophone concerts from other parents. Robert's mind was spinning. The narrative he'd constructed over 20 years of an absent father who'd abandoned his first family without a backward glance was being challenged by physical evidence he couldn't ignore. That doesn't make sense, he said, more to himself than to William. Mom always spoke highly of you to us. She never said a bad word. She didn't have to, William said quietly. Actions speak louder than words, Robert. And in this case, inaction. Letters not delivered. Phone calls not returned. Visitations canceled at the last minute. Robert stood abruptly, gathering the letters. I need to talk to Mom about this. William didn't try to stop him. For what it's worth, he said as Robert headed for the stairs, I don't think she did it to be cruel. I think in her mind, she was protecting you boys from more hurt. From what she saw as my inconsistency and divided attention. Robert paused at the top of the stairs, letters clutched in his hand. That wasn't her decision to make. No, William agreed softly. It wasn't. The drive to his mother's apartment was a blur. Robert's mind raced through childhood memories, re-examining them through this new lens. His mother's gentle explanations for his father's absences. Her insistence that they not bother their father with phone calls about minor achievements or problems. The way she'd subtly discouraged them from spending too much time at William's place after he married Diane. Patricia was watering plants on her small balcony when Robert arrived. Her face lit up at the sight of him, then quickly dimmed as she registered his expression. What's wrong? She asked, setting down her watering can. Without preamble, Robert placed the stack of returned letters on her kitchen counter. Did you keep Dad's letters from us? Patricia's face went pale. She sank slowly into a chair, her eyes fixed on the envelopes. You have to understand, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to protect you. The confirmation hit Robert like a physical blow. Protect us? By lying to us for 20 years. By letting us believe our father didn't care about us. He left us, Robert. Patricia's voice cracked with emotion. He threw away our family for his secretary. Do you know what that did to me? To see him start a new perfect life while I struggled to keep a roof over our heads. To watch him give another woman the happiness he'd promised me. So this was revenge. Robert demanded, punishing him by using us. Patricia shook her head vehemently. No, never. It was. She hesitated, shoulders slumping. At first, I was just so angry. The letters would come, and I'd set them aside, telling myself I'd give them to you boys when I felt stronger. Then weeks would pass, and it seemed too late. After a while, it became easier to maintain the story that he was distant and uninvolved than to explain why I'd kept you from him. Robert paced the small kitchen, trying to process this revelation. What about the visitations he missed? The school events? Patricia's gaze dropped to her hands. Sometimes I told him the wrong dates. Or I'd tell you boys that he couldn't make it when he'd never even been informed. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. I'm not proud of it, Robert. But you have to believe me. I thought I was doing what was best. Best for who, Mom? For us? Or for you? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 2 decades of misconceptions and missed opportunities. Patricia had no answer. Robert grabbed his keys from the counter. "I need some time to think." "Where are you going?" Patricia asked, rising from her chair. "I don't know," Robert admitted honestly. "But for the first time in 20 years, I feel like I need to figure things out for myself, without anyone else's version of the truth clouding the picture." As he walked out of his mother's apartment, Robert felt an odd sense of liberation mixed with profound grief. The simple narrative of villain and victim that had defined his understanding of his parents' divorce had crumbled, leaving a more complex and painful reality in its place. But within that pain was also possibility, the chance to build new relationships based on truth rather than comfortable fictions. He sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine, unsure where to go next. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Daniel? It's me. We need to talk. There's something you should know about Mom and Dad." Daniel sat across from Robert at their old neighborhood diner, the vinyl booth squeaking whenever either of them shifted. Between them lay the stack of returned letters, untouched since Robert had placed them on the table 20 minutes ago. Outside, April rain tapped against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to their stilted conversation. "I don't believe it," Daniel said for the 3rd time, running a hand through his hair. "Mom wouldn't do that." "The evidence is right in front of you," Robert replied, pushing the letters closer to his brother. "Read them yourself." Daniel picked up one of the envelopes, examining the return address label and the return to sender stamp across the front. He opened it carefully and scanned the contents, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to hurt. "I remember this," he said quietly, pointing to a paragraph where William mentioned a science project. "Dad called to congratulate me on winning the state science fair. I told Mom about the call, and she said it was nice of him to remember for once." Daniel looked up at Robert, his eyes troubled. But according to this letter, he was there, in the audience. He saw the whole thing. Robert nodded grimly. "I've been piecing together a lot of memories like that. Things that didn't quite add up, but that I never questioned because I trusted Mom's version of events." The waitress stopped by to refill their coffee cups, her presence temporarily halting the intense conversation. Once she left, Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Have you talked to her about this?" "What did she say?" "She admitted it," Robert said, still finding it difficult to believe. "Said she was trying to protect us from being hurt by Dad's inconsistency." He made air quotes with his fingers, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Maybe she really believed that," Daniel suggested, always the more forgiving of the two. "You know how devastated she was when Dad left. It must have been unbearable to see him starting a new family while she was struggling to raise us alone." "That doesn't give her the right to rewrite our childhoods," Robert countered. "To decide for us what relationship we could have with our father." Daniel sighed, stirring his coffee absently. "No, it doesn't. But people do destructive things when they're in pain. Mom's whole identity was wrapped up in being a wife and mother. When Dad left, it wasn't just a betrayal of her trust. It was an erasure of who she thought she was." Robert considered this. His mother had never remarried, had never even dated seriously as far as he knew. While he and Daniel had moved on with their lives, Patricia had remained frozen in that moment of abandonment, perhaps unable to forge a new identity beyond wronged wife. "I get that she was hurt," Robert conceded. "But this goes beyond hurt feelings, Dan. She manipulated us for decades. Made us believe Dad didn't care when he was trying to reach out the whole time." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know. I'm just trying to understand why. It doesn't make it right, but..." He trailed off, then asked, "What did Dad say when you showed him the letters?" He wasn't surprised. Said he'd suspected something like this was happening, but could never prove it. The court had granted him visitation rights, but when we didn't want to see him, or when Mom told him we didn't want to see him, there wasn't much he could do without dragging us into a bitter legal battle. "So he just gave up?" Daniel sounded disappointed. "Not entirely. Those boxes in his attic show he never really gave up. But after years of letters being returned and calls not being returned, I think he decided to focus on building a relationship with his new family rather than fighting a losing battle for his old one." The brothers fell silent, each lost in his own thoughts. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows and roof. A few tables away, a young family laughed together over shared desserts, a father pretending to steal bites from his daughter's ice cream, while the mother captured the moment on her phone. The ordinary scene of family happiness now seemed fragile to Robert, constructed of moments and choices that could so easily go wrong. "What are you going to do?" Daniel finally asked. Robert sighed. "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront Mom again, demand a full accounting of every lie she ever told us about Dad. Another part just wants to move forward, focus on building a relationship with him now while there's still time." "And what about Mom?" That was the question Robert had been wrestling with since driving away from Patricia's apartment. His anger at her deception was still raw, but beneath it lay a more complicated emotion, sadness for the wounded woman who had raised them, who had made terrible choices out of her own pain. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I can't just pretend this never happened. But she's still our mother. She did the best she could with everything else." Daniel gathered the letters and handed them back to Robert. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But maybe give yourself some time before making any big decisions. This is a lot to process." Robert nodded, grateful for his brother's steadying presence. "What about you? How are you handling all this?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I feel like I'm grieving. Not just for the relationship we could have had with Dad all these years, but for the image I had of Mom as this selfless, perfect parent who sacrificed everything for us. Finding out she's just as flawed and selfish as anyone else." He shook his head. "It's like losing her all over again, in a way." The observation struck Robert forcefully. That was exactly what he was feeling, grief. For the father he could have known, for the mother he thought he had, for the family that might have been different if truth had prevailed over pain. As they paid the bill and prepared to leave, Daniel placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "Just remember, it's never too late to start over. Look at you and Dad. 3 months ago you weren't speaking, and now you're teaching Emma to drive." Robert managed a small smile. "Yeah, it's something. It's more than something," Daniel insisted. "It's proof that even the most broken relationships can be repaired if both people are willing to try." Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Robert offered to drive Daniel home, but his brother declined, saying he needed the walk to clear his head. They embraced briefly before parting ways, a gesture that had become more frequent between them in recent months. Alone in his car, Robert pulled out his phone and hesitated over his contacts. After a moment, he bypassed both his parents' numbers and called Sarah instead. His ex-wife answered on the third ring, surprise evident in her voice. "Robert, is everything okay?" "Not really," he admitted. "I've just discovered some things about my parents that have me questioning everything. I know it's out of the blue, but I could use a friend right now. Someone who knows me but isn't involved in all this family drama." There was a brief pause before Sarah answered, her voice softer than before. "Where are you? I could meet you for a drink if you want to talk." The simple kindness in her offer brought a lump to Robert's throat. "I'd like that. Thank you." As he drove to meet Sarah, Robert reflected on how quickly life could change course. A month ago, he would never have called his ex-wife for support. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have spoken to his father at all. And just yesterday, he had believed a version of his childhood that had proven to be largely fiction. What other truths might be waiting to be discovered? He wondered if he could find the courage to keep looking. The neighborhood coffee shop where Robert agreed to meet Sarah was busy for a Tuesday afternoon. He spotted her at a corner table, 2 steaming mugs already waiting. She'd cut her hair since he'd last seen her at the divorce finalization meeting, a stylish bob that framed her face in a way that reminded him of when they'd first met in graduate school. She wore no makeup, just a touch of lip balm, and looked more rested than she had during their final tumultuous months together. "I got you the usual," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "Though I guess it's been long enough that your usual might have changed." Robert wrapped his hands around the mug, black coffee with a splash of cream, exactly how he'd always taken it. "Some things don't change," he said, attempting a smile. Sarah studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "You look awful, and I mean that in the most caring way possible." A surprised laugh escaped him. This was what he'd always appreciated about Sarah, her direct honesty, even when it wasn't flattering. "I haven't been sleeping well. Because of whatever family drama you mentioned on the phone." Robert nodded, unsure where to begin. It felt strange discussing family matters with Sarah when his inability to open up about his childhood had been one of the issues that led to their divorce. Yet here she was, offering a sympathetic ear when he needed it most. I found out my mother kept me and Daniel from having a relationship with our father, he finally said. The words still strange to his ears despite having repeated them to himself countless times over the past week. She intercepted his letters, lied about visitations, basically manipulated us into believing he'd abandoned us when he was trying to stay involved the whole time. Sarah's eyes widened. Wow, that's a lot to process. Yeah, Robert agreed, taking a sip of his coffee. It's like finding out the past 20 years of my life have been based on a lie. Everything I thought I knew about my parents, about why our family fell apart, it's all different now. How did you discover this? Robert explained about the letters in William's attic, his confrontation with Patricia, and the subsequent conversations with Daniel and his father. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. The thing is, Robert continued, I built so much of my identity around being the abandoned son. It shaped how I saw relationships, how I approached commitment. He hesitated, then added, how I approached our marriage. Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. You were always waiting for the other shoe to drop. For me to leave, like your father supposedly left. I never fully trusted that you would stay, Robert admitted, the confession both painful and liberating. Not because of anything you did, but because I believe that's just what people do, they leave. And finding out now that my father didn't choose to leave us, that he tried to stay involved but was prevented. He shook his head. It makes me wonder how different things might have been. For us, I mean, if I hadn't been carrying around all that baggage. Sarah reached across the table and briefly squeezed his hand. We can't rewrite the past, Robert. And our issues weren't solely about your family history. We both made mistakes. I know, he acknowledged. I'm not suggesting we could have fixed everything. Just thinking about how much our childhoods shape us, often in ways we don't even recognize until much later. They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, spring had arrived in earnest, with cherry blossoms dotting the trees along the street and people shedding their winter coats for lighter jackets. Have you talked to your mother again? Sarah asked eventually. Not since I found the letters. I've been avoiding her calls. I'm not sure what to say to her yet. That's understandable. But eventually, you'll need to have that conversation. Robert nodded reluctantly. Daniel says the same thing. He's already met with her once. Says she's a mess, crying, apologizing, the works. And you don't believe her remorse is genuine? I'm not sure what to believe anymore, Robert admitted. For 2 decades, she maintained this elaborate fiction, portrayed herself as the victim when she was actively preventing any reconciliation. It's hard to trust anything she says now. Sarah considered this. I'm not defending what she did. It was wrong, unquestionably. But having met your mother, having seen how she lights up when she talks about you and Daniel, I don't think she's a manipulative person by nature. I think she made a terrible choice during the worst period of her life, and then got trapped in that choice as the years went on. It was a more generous assessment than Robert currently felt capable of, but he appreciated Sarah's perspective. She had always been able to see situations with more nuance than he could, especially when emotions ran high. What does your father think you should do? Sarah asked. Robert laughed humorlessly. That's the strangest part. He's advocating for forgiveness. Says he understands why she did what she did, even though it cost him a relationship with his sons. Says holding on to anger will only hurt me in the long run. Wise man, Sarah commented. Wiser than you gave him credit for. Apparently. A brief, awkward silence fell between them as both recognized the parallel to their own situation. Robert had harbored resentment towards Sarah after their separation, blaming her for giving up on their marriage when things got difficult. Only now did he realize how much of that narrative had been shaped by his own unresolved issues. I owe you an apology, he said suddenly, for not being the partner you deserved, for keeping you at arm's length emotionally, for blaming you when things fell apart. Sarah looked surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. That's not why I agreed to meet you today, Robert. You don't need to. I know, he interrupted gently. But discovering all this has made me realize how many relationships I've sabotaged because of beliefs that weren't even true. I can't change the past, but I can at least acknowledge my part in it. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you. That means a lot. Another silence fell, more comfortable this time. Robert found himself noticing small details about Sarah he had once taken for granted. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking, the small scar on her wrist from a cooking accident during their first year of marriage. the intensity with which she focused on whoever was speaking. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked, bringing him back to the present. "About your parents, I mean." Robert sighed. "I'm having dinner with my father and his family on Friday. Emma's got some big debate tournament coming up, and apparently I promised to help her practice her arguments." "And your mother?" "That's the harder question." Robert stared into his now empty coffee mug. "Part of me wants to cut her off completely, but another part recognizes that would be repeating the same pattern, allowing one mistake, however significant, to define an entire relationship." "For what it's worth," Sarah said carefully, "I think you should talk to her. Not immediately if you're not ready, but eventually. Hear her full story. Try to understand why she made the choices she did, even if you can't forgive them yet." "When did you get so wise about family dynamics?" Robert asked with a small smile. Sarah returned the smile. "I've been seeing a therapist since our divorce, trying to understand my own patterns, the things I bring to relationships that aren't always helpful." She hesitated, then added, "It's been enlightening. Painful sometimes, but worth it." Robert nodded, considering this. "Maybe that's something I should look into. Clearly, I've been carrying around some pretty significant misunderstandings about my own family history." "It might help," Sarah agreed, "especially with everything that's coming up now." As their conversation drew to a natural close, Robert was struck by how easy it had been to talk to Sarah, despite their complicated history. There was a freedom in no longer trying to protect a relationship that had already ended, in being able to speak honestly without fear of causing irreparable damage. "Thank you for this," he said as they stood to leave. "For listening. For the perspective. I know it's probably the last thing you expected when I called." "That's what friends do," Sarah replied. Then, with a hint of uncertainty, "We can be friends, can't we? Now that some time has passed." The question caught Robert off guard. During their marriage, Sarah had been his best friend as well as his wife. After the divorce, he'd lost both roles at once, leaving a void he'd filled with work and, more recently, scotch. "I'd like that," he said sincerely. "I've missed talking to you." Outside the coffee shop, they paused awkwardly, neither quite sure how to end the encounter. Finally, Sarah leaned in and gave him a quick hug. "Call your mother," she said as she pulled away. "Not for her sake, for yours." As Robert watched her walk toward her car, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The path forward was still unclear, the wounds still fresh, but for the first time, he could envision a future where those wounds might eventually heal. Not into perfect wholeness, perhaps, but into something bearable, something that allowed for new growth. He pulled out his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, texted his mother, "We need to talk. I'll come by on Sunday afternoon." Her response came almost immediately, "I'll be here. Thank you for giving me a chance." Robert stared at the message for a long moment before putting his phone away. He wasn't sure what would come of their conversation, what further revelations or painful truths might emerge. But he knew he couldn't move forward without facing the past head-on. All of it, not just the version he'd been told to believe. Patricia's apartment looked different somehow, though nothing had visibly changed since Robert's last visit. Same beige walls adorned with family photos. Same faded floral couch where he'd spent countless hours watching TV as a teenager. Same collection of ceramic birds arranged meticulously on the bookshelf, a hobby his mother had taken up after the divorce. Yet everything felt altered, as if he were viewing it all through a new lens. His mother opened the door before he could knock, her face a mixture of hope and apprehension. She'd lost weight in the 2 weeks since their confrontation. Her sweater hung loosely on her frame, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "You came," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Robert nodded, removing his jacket and hanging it on the coat rack by the door, a habit ingrained since childhood. "I said I would." They settled in the living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Patricia had prepared coffee and Robert's favorite almond cookies, a peace offering he acknowledged with a small nod but didn't touch. "I don't know where to begin," Patricia finally said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "The truth would be a good start," Robert replied, trying to keep the edge from his voice. "The whole truth this time." Patricia took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I never meant for it to go so far. After your father left, I was devastated doesn't begin to cover it. I felt humiliated, abandoned, like I'd failed at the one thing that defined me. Our family." Robert remained silent, giving her space to continue. "When the first letters came, I was still so angry. I told myself I'd give them to you boys after I'd calmed down, after I could talk about William without breaking down. But days turned into weeks, and it became harder to explain why I'd kept them. She looked away, shame evident in her posture. Then he started seeing Diane regularly, and I couldn't bear the thought of sharing you with them, with their perfect new life. So you decided to erase him from our lives instead? Robert asked quietly. Patricia flinched at his directness, but didn't deny it. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more a series of small choices that became a pattern. A visitation I'd forget to tell him about. A school event I'd give him the wrong time for. And you boys were so young. You accepted my explanations without question. What about as we got older, when we could have made our own decisions about having a relationship with Dad? She looked down at her hands. By then, the lie had grown too big. You both had formed such strong opinions about your father based on what you thought was his absence. I was afraid, terrified, really, of what would happen if you discovered the truth. That you'd hate me, that I'd lose you both. So instead, we lost our father, Robert said, the weight of those lost years heavy in his voice. Yes, Patricia admitted, a tear sliding down her cheek. And I've had to live with that knowledge every day. Watching you struggle with trust issues, seeing how it affected your relationships, your marriage. She trailed off, then added in a whisper, knowing it was my fault. Robert let that settle between them, neither confirming nor denying her role in his own failed marriage. The parallels weren't lost on him. How his mother's fear of abandonment had led her to actions that ultimately drove people away. How his own fear of being left had created a self-fulfilling prophecy with Sarah. Does Dad know the full extent of it? He asked after a moment. Patricia nodded. I called him after you left that day. We talked for hours, our first real conversation in 2 decades. I told him everything, apologized for the years I stole from all of us. A sad smile crossed her face. He was kinder than I deserved. That matched what William had told Robert during their most recent lunch, that Patricia had reached out, that they'd had a difficult but necessary conversation about the past. His father had emphasized that while he couldn't forget what had happened, he'd chosen to forgive for his own peace of mind, if nothing else. Daniel says you're seeing a therapist now, Robert said, changing the subject slightly. Twice a week, Patricia confirmed. I should have done it years ago, after the divorce. Maybe things would have turned out differently. Robert considered this. Maybe. Or maybe we all needed to walk our own paths to get where we are now. An unexpected calm had settled over him during this conversation. The white-hot anger that had consumed him upon discovering his mother's deception had cooled into something more manageable, a deep sadness for what might have been, mixed with a surprising compassion for the broken woman before him. I don't expect you to forgive me, Patricia said, wiping away tears. I wouldn't in your position. But I hope someday you might understand that I never meant to hurt you. Everything I did, however misguided, came from love. A distorted kind of love, Robert observed without malice. Yes, she agreed. Possessive, fearful, not the unconditional love you deserved. She hesitated, then asked, how is your relationship with your father now? The question surprised him. He'd expected her to be jealous or resentful of his growing connection with William, but her expression showed only genuine interest. It's evolving, he answered honestly. We're getting to know each other. I'm getting to know Emma, and Jacob too. He watched carefully for her reaction. Patricia nodded, a flicker of pain crossing her face, but no anger. They seem like good kids, from what Daniel has told me. They are, Robert confirmed. Emma reminds me of Daniel sometimes. Same analytical mind, same dry humor. And Jacob? He smiled slightly. Jacob is obsessed with vintage vinyl records. Has this whole collection he's been piecing together from thrift shops. Like you at that age, Patricia observed softly. You used to spend every allowance at that record store on 5th Street. The shared memory created a momentary bridge between them, a reminder that despite everything, she knew him in ways no one else did, had been present for the formative moments that had shaped him. I've been thinking about family therapy, Robert said after a pause. For all of us, you, me, Daniel, Dad. Maybe even Emma and Jacob eventually, if they're comfortable with it. A neutral space to work through some of this history with professional guidance. Hope flickered in Patricia's eyes. I'd like that. If you and Daniel and your father are willing. Dad already agreed. Said it was long overdue. Daniel's considering it. Robert leaned forward, meeting his mother's gaze directly. But I need you to understand something first. If we do this, it has to be with complete honesty. No more convenient versions of the truth. No more manipulations, however well-intentioned. I understand, Patricia said solemnly. No more secrets. Robert nodded, satisfied with her sincerity, if not yet fully trusting it. Trust, he was learning, would take time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. They talked for another hour, covering ground they hadn't touched in years. Patricia shared stories about Robert's childhood that he'd forgotten, filling in gaps in his memory with details both trivial and meaningful. He told her about his recent lunch with Sarah, his tentative steps toward friendship with his ex-wife, and was surprised by his mother's genuine pleasure at the news. She was always good for you, Patricia remarked. Kept you grounded when you'd get lost in your own head. Robert raised an eyebrow. I thought you two didn't get along. Patricia looked embarrassed. That was more my issue than hers. She saw through me sometimes, in ways that made me uncomfortable. I think she suspected I wasn't always truthful about your father. The admission was another small piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Sarah had once mentioned feeling like Patricia was keeping her at arm's length, preventing her from fully integrating into the family. At the time, Robert had dismissed it as typical mother-in-law tensions. Now he wondered what else he might have misinterpreted through the distorted lens his mother had created. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the apartment, Robert prepared to leave. He had promised to meet Emma for dinner to help her prepare for an upcoming debate tournament, a commitment that would once have been unthinkable but now felt natural, even welcome. At the door, Patricia hesitated, then asked, "Will I see you again soon?" The question held layers of meaning. Would he continue to be part of her life? Could they build something new from the ashes of her deception? Was forgiveness possible, or at least a path toward it? "I'll call you next week," Robert said, not making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "Maybe we can have lunch sometime." It was a small offering, but Patricia received it as the gift it was. "I'd like that very much." As Robert drove away, he felt a curious lightness. The conversation hadn't erased the past or magically healed the deep wounds his mother's actions had caused, but it had opened a door that had been closed for too long, allowing fresh air into spaces that had grown stagnant with half-truths and misunderstandings. His phone rang as he was turning onto the highway. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "How did it go?" his brother asked when Robert answered. "Better than expected. Harder than I hoped." Robert merged into traffic, the familiar motions of driving allowing him to process as he spoke. "We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. And I think we might be okay. Eventually. Not the same as before, but maybe something more honest." Daniel's relief was audible. "That's good, Rob. Really good. What about you? How are you handling all this?" "One day at a time," Daniel replied. "Some days I'm angry. Other days I just feel sad for everyone involved. Mom, Dad, us. The family we could have been." It was a sentiment Robert understood all too well. Yet alongside the grief for what had been lost ran a thin thread of hope for what might still be possible. Not a return to innocence, but perhaps a wiser, more compassionate connection built on the full truth of their shared history. "Emma's debate tournament is next Saturday," Robert said, changing the subject. "Dad mentioned you might come." "Wouldn't miss it," Daniel confirmed. "Sophie's excited to cheer for her cool cousin." Her words, not mine. Robert smiled at the thought of his niece. "Maybe we could all get lunch afterward? You, me, Dad, the kids?" He hesitated, then added, "Mom too, if everyone's comfortable with that." There was a pause on the line as Daniel considered the suggestion. One big happy family reunion? That might be pushing it. "Not happy, necessarily," Robert clarified. "Not yet, but family still. Despite everything." "Despite everything," Daniel echoed, a note of wonder in his voice. "Yeah, okay. Let's try it. What's the worst that could happen?" Robert laughed. "Given our family history, that's a dangerous question." "True," Daniel conceded. "But maybe it's time we start asking different questions. Like, what's the best that could happen if we all decide to move forward together?" It was a perspective shift Robert hadn't considered, focusing on potential healing rather than past wounds. On the road ahead instead of the one already traveled. "I'll call Mom," Daniel offered. "Feel things out. See if she's ready for something like that." "Thanks," Robert said, grateful once again for his brother's steadying presence through this turbulent time. As he ended the call and continued toward his dinner with Emma, Robert reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. From isolated bitterness to tentative reconciliation. From comfortable fictions to painful truths. From a fragmented past to the possibility of a more integrated future. The road to healing would be long, with detours and setbacks along the way. Old habits of thought wouldn't disappear overnight. Trust broken over decades wouldn't be restored in a matter of weeks. But for the first time since discovering the letters in his father's attic, Robert felt a sense of direction, a North Star guiding him through the complicated terrain of family, forgiveness, and the flawed, human love that connected them all.